On June 28, 1914, an heir to an empire and his wife were gunned down in Sarajevo. A single afternoon, and within weeks, Europe was at war. Within a year, millions were dead. History textbooks often treat Sarajevo as the cause, the moment the world snapped. But that is one of the greatest distortions of modern memory, the belief that catastrophes begin with sparks. Sparks do not create infernos, unless the structure is already drenched in fuel. Sarajevo did not create World War I, it activated it. The deeper question is not, who did one man shoot? The deeper question is, why did every great power respond, as if continental war were an acceptable solution? What kind of system turns a Balkan murder into an industrial slaughter? History is often taught through events: an assassination, a treaty, a battle, a date. But events are surface triggers. Structure is the engine. By 1914, Europe was not peaceful with tensions. Europe was a militarized pressure chamber. Germany had risen faster than Britain expected. Its industry surged. Its fleet expanded. Its commercial reach grew. The British Empire did not see Germany as simply another state. It saw a systemic challenger. Russia was recovering from humiliation. France lived with the unresolved trauma of 1871. Austria-Hungary was disintegrating. The Balkans were the fault line. Sarajevo did not invent suspicion. Suspicion was already the atmosphere. Sarajevo did not create rivalry. Rivalry was already doctrine. The machine was already built. The assassination simply switched it on. The assassination produced outrage. A response was expected. Austria moved to punish Serbia. Germany offered support, believing the crisis would remain local. No one imagined the scale of what was coming. That is the danger of alliance systems. Regional violence becomes systematic motion. Sarajevo did not create the machine, it activated it. And this is where hidden history shifts the lens. Because the deepest question is not Serbia, the deepest question is Britain. Britain was not a Balkan power. Britain was the central imperial power. And Britain's foreign policy was not forged in public debate. It was forged in private understandings, elite continuity, and strategic assumptions inherited long before July 1914. By the time Parliament spoke, the architecture was already built. Naval coordination with France already assumed. Military conversations already underway. Choices already narrowed. The public story would come later. The commitments came first. This is what policy before publicity means. War becomes thinkable before democracy is even consulted. Escalation without control. Austria's ultimatum to Serbia became the turning point, not because Austria desired a continental war, but because Austria believed it could respond forcefully and still keep the crisis limited. The assassination had shocked Europe. A reaction was expected. Austria rightfully assumed it had legitimacy. The ultimatum was meant as enforcement, a demonstration that Serbia could not be tolerated as a destabilizing force, assassinating whoever it wanted. And Serbia accepted most of it, but not all, because it secretly had Russian support, and in that margin, the machinery began to move. The tragedy is not that Austria wanted world war. The tragedy is that Austria misread the system it was acting inside. Once great powers enter a crisis under alliance commitments, events acquire momentum beyond intention. Russia could not abandon Serbia without losing stature. Germany could not tolerate Russian mobilization without acting. France could not abandon Russia without collapsing its strategy. This is not friendship, it is structure. And the structure was already continental. Russia had committed itself to Serbia, France had committed itself to Russia, and Britain, long before Parliament spoke, had entered into understandings that aligned it with both France and Russia. The crisis was no longer local. And here is the key. By 1914, Britain was not neutral in practice. Long before Parliament debated war, British elites had already entered into understandings with France, naval coordination, military conversations, private assurances, commitments made quietly, without a democratic mandate, but with enormous strategic consequences. This is what policy before publicity means. Choices were being narrowed before the public knew there were choices at all. And then came Belgium. When Germany invaded Belgium, Britain presented it as the decisive moral rupture, a violation of neutrality, a defense of international law. And that mattered. Belgium was real. The outrage was real. But hidden history insists we see the deeper structure. Belgium was the public trigger, not the private beginning. Because long before Belgium was crossed, British planning had already assumed the possibility of war alongside France and had already made agreements with Belgium. Between Britain and France there were naval understandings, military conversations, strategic commitments made quietly much earlier than 1914. Belgium became the moment the justification became speakable. The architecture, however, was already built, and men like Sir Edward Grey had been operating in this twilight zone, not issuing orders like dictators, but shaping the field of possibility through access, ambiguity, and private commitment. Germany's rise was already being interpreted as a threat to the structure of British supremacy way before 1914. Containment was not invented in July, it was inherited. And once such assumptions harden, peace becomes only a postponement. Britain is often remembered as reluctantly dragged into the war. But hidden history insists that this is misleading. Britain was not simply pulled in. Britain's governing class had been preparing the architecture for years. The entente with France was not merely cordial diplomacy. It carried strategic weight. Military staff talks were already occurring. Naval commitments were already assumed. Plans were already imagined. So when 1914 arrived, Britain did not face a clean democratic choice between peace and war. Britain faced a field of options already narrowed by elite continuity. This is institutional reality. Foreign policy in an imperial state is not made primarily in Parliament. It is made through permanent offices, through access, through private commitments, through the control of information, through the quiet shaping of what is realistic. Gray's ambiguity was not neutral. It was strategic. It left Germany uncertain. It left France expectant. And it preserved Britain's freedom of maneuver while the machinery accelerated. By the time the public story was told, the deeper decisions had already been taken. And this is what makes the author's argument structural. Not that Britain was run by puppeteers, but that empire is governed by networks. And networks reproduce policy long before it becomes visible. After catastrophe, society searched for comfort. and the most comforting story is inevitability. But hidden history insists World War I was not inevitable. It was the result of alliances forged by Britain with Russia and France. Commitments were activated, mobilizations were ordered, choices were narrowed long before the public understood there were choices at all. The tragedy is not that Europe was cursed by fate, but that imperial systems made escalation seem rational. So what is Sarajevo's lesson? Not that history turns on a single act, but that a single act can release forces already arranged. Sarajevo was not the origin, it was the moment that architecture became visible. Commitments activated, assumptions hardened, choices narrowed. World War I did not arrive as fate, it emerged as policy, inside an imperial system that had already defined what was necessary. And that is why 1914 matters, because catastrophes do not begin when the public notices. They begin when the structures of power decide what is thinkable. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to continue the Hidden History video series.